He wasn't supposed to bark, not at a coffin, not at a farewell carved in silence, not when every man in uniform had already accepted the end. The wind moved low across the cemetery, carrying the scent of damp earth and eucalyptus, brushing softly against polished boots lined in perfect rows, while the Australian flag rested heavy and still across the coffin, as if even the air itself had chosen to stand at attention. They said Captain Liam Carter had come home, said the mission was over, said this was where the story ended, but Rex did not move, did not blink, did not understand the word ended. He lay pressed against the timber like it still held warmth, his body curled tight along the edge, ears pinned low yet alert, amber eyes fixed on something no one else could see. A handler tried once, gently, calling his name in a voice trained to command, but Rex did not respond, not even a flick of the tail, only a low breath that trembled against the grain of the wood, as though he were listening, as though somewhere beneath the sealed stillness there was a heartbeat out of rhythm with the world above. The gathered crowd shifted uneasily, whispers threading through the still air, boots scraping lightly against gravel measured in quiet centimeters, because something about the dog unsettled the ceremony, something about the way he refused to grieve in the expected way. Liam had been more than a name stitched onto a uniform, more than the man with the easy grin and the faded tattoo of a shepherd inked along his right forearm. He had been the kind who carried others forward when the road ran out. And Rex had been there for every step, every kilometer across red dust and distant ground, every silent signal exchanged without words. They had worked as one, not through command, but through trust built in moments no one else ever saw, the kind of bond that doesn't loosen just because someone says it should. A faint breeze lifted the edge of the flag for a second, barely noticeable, just enough for Rex's ears to twitch, and then he shifted, pressing closer, nose brushing the seam of the coffin as if tracing a scent that refused to fade. One of the older officers cleared his throat, eyes narrowing slightly, not in anger, but in something quieter, something closer to doubt, because Rex wasn't restless, wasn't confused, he was certain, and certainty like that didn't belong in a place meant for endings. Time stretched, slow and heavy, the kind that makes even a single minute feel like it's measured and long, dragging meters instead of seconds, and still the dog remained, unmoved by the ceremony, untouched by the finality everyone else had accepted. Somewhere in the distance, a magpie called, sharp and out of place, cutting through the silence like a question no one wanted to answer, and Rex's gaze sharpened, his body tensing just slightly, not with fear, but with recognition. He let out a sound then, not loud, not aggressive, just a low, deliberate rumble that settled into the ground beneath them, the kind of sound that doesn't ask for attention but demands it anyway. Heads turned. Conversation stopped. Even the wind seemed to pause. Because there was something in that sound, something that didn't belong to grief, something closer to refusal. They had brought Liam home in a sealed box, measured, labeled, processed, everything in its place, everything accounted for down to the last detail. But Rex had never been trained to trust labels. Only instincts, only the quiet truths carried in scent and breath and presence. He shifted again, placing one paw gently against the coffin, holding it there as if anchoring himself to something slipping just beyond reach. And for a moment, just a moment, it felt as though the entire world leaned in to listen with him, waiting for something no one could name, something that should not have been there, and yet refused to leave. No one gave the command to continue, yet no one stepped forward to end it either. As if the ceremony itself had become uncertain of its own purpose, suspended between what was known and what could not be explained, while Rex remained anchored to the coffin with a stillness that felt heavier than grief, heavier than obedience, something older, something instinctive, the kind of knowing that did not come from training but from bond. A light drizzle began to fall, soft enough to barely mark the polished timber, each drop tracing quiet lines that caught the muted gray of the sky. And still the flag did not move, pinned in place by its own weight, by the meaning it carried, by the finality it represented for everyone except the one creature who refused to accept it. Sergeant Noah Bennett stood a few steps back from the front line, his hands clasped behind him, posture rigid in habit but eyes unsettled, watching the dog in a way that did not match the formality of the moment, because he had seen Rex before, not like this, but close enough to recognize when something was wrong. And this was not the behavior of a dog mourning. This was the behavior of a dog waiting. He shifted his weight slightly, boots pressing into the damp grass by a few centimeters, leaning just enough to catch the angle of Rex's gaze. And what he saw there was not confusion, not distress, but focus, sharp and unwavering, as if the world had narrowed to a single point that only Rex could see. Someone behind him whispered that it was time, that they could not delay any longer, that protocols existed for a reason, but the words felt hollow, drifting across the space without landing anywhere solid, because even those speaking them kept their distance, kept their voices low, as if raising them might break something fragile that had not yet revealed itself. Rex inhaled slowly, deeply, his chest rising against the side of the coffin, nose pressed along the seam where would met lid, tracing it again and again as though following a trail that had not faded. And then he paused, head tilting slightly, ears lifting just enough to catch something beyond human hearing, something buried beneath layers of silence and expectation. Noah felt it then, not a sound, not anything he could name, but a shift, subtle and undeniable, like the air before a storm that never quite arrives, and he stepped forward without realizing it, closing the distance by less than a meter, close enough now to see the fine tremor in Rex's whiskers, the way his paw remained fixed against the coffin as if holding it in place. "Mate," Noah murmured under his breath, not as an order, not even as comfort, just a quiet acknowledgement that he did not fully understand what he was seeing, and Rex did not turn, did not respond, but the rumble in his chest deepened slightly, steady and controlled, not a warning, but a refusal to yield. The chaplain cleared his throat gently, eyes moving between the officers, searching for someone to restore order, to bring the moment back within the lines it was meant to follow. Yet no one stepped in, no one claimed that authority, because something about the dog made certainty feel premature. A faint metallic clink echoed from somewhere nearby, a buckle, a clasp, nothing out of place, and yet Rex's head lifted sharply, eyes narrowing, his entire body tightening for a fraction of a second before settling again, as though confirming something only he could verify. Noah's gaze followed instinctively, scanning the coffin, the edges, the fittings, the uniform arrangement of detail, everything exactly as it should be, and still he felt that quiet dissonance, that sense that the picture was complete but not correct. He remembered then, unbidden, a training exercise months back, when Rex had refused to move past a supply crate that had already been cleared, handlers insisting it was empty, sensors confirming it, yet Rex had stayed, insistent, until they opened it again and found something overlooked, something small but significant, and Liam had only laughed, rubbing the dog's neck, saying trust the one who does not need to speak. The memory settled heavily now, not as nostalgia, but as warning. The drizzle thickened slightly, tapping gently against the wood, against the flag, against shoulders and caps, and still no one moved to lift Rex away, because the longer he stayed, the harder it became to believe he was wrong. Noah took another step forward, slower this time, deliberate, feeling the weight of every eye behind him, every expectation, every rule that said this moment should proceed, and yet his hand did not reach for the dog, did not pull him back, instead hovering just above Rex's shoulder, close enough to feel the warmth, the steady tension held beneath the fur. "Something's off," he said quietly, barely above the sound of the rain, and, for the first time, someone answered, not with dismissal, but with silence that agreed. Rex shifted his paw, pressing it more firmly against the coffin, claws lightly catching the grain, not scratching, not frantic, just anchoring, holding, as if whatever lay beyond that barrier was not gone, not yet, not finished. And in that stillness, in that suspended breath between certainty and doubt, the idea began to take shape, fragile but persistent, that perhaps the farewell had arrived too soon, that perhaps the story they had been given was missing something essential, something that only a dog, bound not by protocol but by loyalty, had refused to let go. The rain settled into a steady rhythm now, soft but persistent, tapping across fabric and with like a quiet insistence that time was still moving, even if no one dared to acknowledge it, while Noah's hand hovered just above Rex's shoulder, feeling the tension coiled beneath the fur, not fear, not confusion, but resolve, the kind that did not shift under pressure, the kind that held fast when everything else said to let go. He drew in a slow breath, the cool air filling his chest with the scent of wet grass and polished timber, and then he lowered his hand, not to pull the dog away, but to rest it lightly against him, grounding himself as much as offering contact, and Rex did not flinch, did not break focus, only leaned ever so slightly into that touch without taking his eyes off the coffin, as though allowing the connection but refusing the distraction. Behind them, boots shifted again, a murmur passed between officers, measured in low tones that tried to maintain authority but carried something else beneath, uncertainty threading through discipline, because the longer this moment stretched, the harder it became to treat it as an interruption rather than a signal. The chaplain stepped forward, voice calm but firmer now, suggesting they proceed, that respect required closure, that the living needed to move forward even when it felt incomplete, and for a second it seemed the weight of expectation might finally tip the balance, that someone would step in, lift Rex away, and restore the ceremony to its intended path. But before any hand reached him, Rex moved first. It was subtle, not a sudden action, but a deliberate shift, his head lowering until his nose pressed firmly along the edge where lid met base. Inhaling deeply, then pausing, then inhaling again, slower this time, as though confirming something beyond doubt. And then he exhaled through his nose in a controlled breath that carried a low vibration through his chest, not loud enough to startle, but strong enough to be felt by those closest. A resonance that settled into the space between them like a truth spoken without words. Noah felt it clearly now, that same sensation from before, but sharper, more defined, and he glanced toward the coffin again, really looking this time, not at what it represented, but at what it was, the lines, the fittings, the stillness that seemed too perfect, too absolute. And in that perfection, something felt wrong, not visibly, not in any way he could point to, but in the absence of something that should have been there. He remembered Liam's voice, steady and grounded, saying once that absence could be louder than presence if you knew what to listen for, and the thought landed heavier than it should have in a place meant for quiet goodbyes. "We should check," Noah said, his voice low but clear enough to carry, not a command, not yet, but a suggestion that refused to fade once spoken, and it drew attention in a way louder words might not have, because it echoed what others had begun to feel but had not yet named. One of the senior officers frowned slightly, glancing between Noah and the coffin, weighing protocol against instinct, the measured structure of military procedure against the unpredictable certainty of a dog who had never once been wrong in the field. And for a long second, no one spoke, no one moved, as though the decision itself required a kind of permission no one was certain they held. Rex lifted his head then, just enough to look directly at Noah for the first time, their eyes meeting in a brief, unbroken connection that carried more clarity than any spoken instruction. And then Rex returned his gaze to the coffin, pressing his paw again against the wood, firmer this time, holding it there as if insisting that whatever answer lay beyond it could not remain hidden. The rain eased slightly, as though even the sky had paused to watch, the sound softening to a faint mist that clung to uniforms and skin, and in that softened silence, the weight of the moment shifted, no longer held in uncertainty, but leaning toward decision. The officer closest to the coffin stepped forward at last, movements careful, deliberate, as though approaching something fragile rather than something final, and he glanced once more at the others, receiving no objection, only that same quiet agreement that had replaced doubt. Noah stepped back half a pace, not retreating, but making space, his hand slipping from Rex's shoulder as the dog remained exactly where he was, unmoving except for the steady rise and fall of his breath, eyes fixed, waiting, always waiting. Fingers reached for the edge of the coffin, hesitating for a fraction of a second that stretched long enough to feel like a question asked without words, and then settled into place, the contact light but certain, and in that instant, before anything had been opened, before any truth had been revealed, it was already clear that whatever came next would not simply confirm what they believed, but challenge it, reshape it, and perhaps reveal that the bond between a man and his dog had seen, something the rest of them had missed entirely. The moment his fingers settled against the edge, the world seemed to narrow to that single point of contact, as though everything that had come before had been leading to this quiet decision, this fragile crossing between belief and doubt. And no one spoke, not even a whisper, because words felt too heavy, too certain for a moment that carried so much uncertainty within it. The officer drew in a steady breath, shoulders lifting slightly beneath the weight of uniform and expectation, then exhaled slowly as his grip firmed, not forceful, not abrupt, just enough to begin, just enough to acknowledge that something had shifted beyond protocol, beyond ceremony, into something more human, more instinctive. Rex did not move away, did not step back, but leaned forward instead, his nose hovering a fraction above the seam, ears angled forward, body poised with a stillness that felt almost reverent, as though he understood the gravity of what was about to happen in a way no one else could fully grasp. The lid responded with the faintest resistance, a soft sound, not loud enough to break the quiet, but enough to be heard by every person present, a gentle release that seemed to echo louder than it should, carrying through the damp air and settling into the chest like a held breath finally let go. Noah felt it in that instant, a tightening beneath his ribs, not fear, not anticipation, but something closer to recognition, as though he had already stepped into the outcome before it revealed itself, guided by the same unspoken certainty that held Rex in place. The lid lifted slowly, measured in careful centimeters, the motion deliberate, controlled, as though moving too quickly might disturb something unseen, something delicate that lingered between what was expected and what might be true. A faint scent escaped first, not unpleasant, not alarming, just the sterile trace of preservation, the quiet signature of something processed, contained, and yet Rex's reaction was immediate, his nose drawing closer, inhaling deeply, then pausing again, his body tightening for a brief second before settling into a stillness that spoke louder than any movement. The officer raised the lid further, revealing the form within, and for a moment, no one reacted, because what they saw aligned with what they had been told, the uniform, the arrangement, the stillness that matched the story, and yet something in that alignment felt wrong, like a photograph that captured every detail but missed the soul entirely. Noah stepped closer without thinking, closing the distance by less than a meter, his eyes scanning the face, the features, searching not for difference, but for familiarity, and it was in that search that the absence became undeniable. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, the kind of detail that could be overlooked by anyone not looking closely, but once seen, it could not be unseen, the structure of the jaw slightly off, the line of the brow not quite matching. Memory, and most of all, the absence of something that had always been present in Liam, even in rest, even in silence, a certain tension, a quiet readiness that this stillness did not carry. Rex exhaled slowly, a low sound barely audible, and then he stepped back half a pace, not retreating, but releasing his hold on the coffin, his paw lifting from the wood for the first time since the ceremony had begun, and in that small movement, everything shifted. The murmurs returned, not hushed now, but rising in uncertain waves, questions forming without answers, eyes moving from the open coffin to one another, searching for confirmation, for denial, for anything that could anchor the moment back into something understandable. The officer holding the lid froze, his posture locked, gaze fixed downward as if trying to reconcile what he saw with what he had been told, and Noah spoke again, his voice steadier now, carrying a clarity that cut through the confusion without force. "That is not him," he said, not loudly, not aggressively, just simply, as though stating something that had already been decided long before this moment. The words hung in the air, fragile but undeniable, and no one immediately challenged them, because the truth of them was already settling into place, piece by piece, reshaping the scene in ways no one had prepared for. Rex turned his head slightly, looking not at the coffin now, but out beyond it, toward the distance where the trees lined the edge of the cemetery, his gaze fixed on something unseen, something that called him forward rather than back, and he took a step in that direction, then paused, glancing briefly over his shoulder as if checking that the others would follow, that they would finally see what he had been trying to show them all along. Noah felt the shift within himself then, the moment where doubt gave way to action, where the weight of protocol loosened just enough to allow instinct to lead, and he stepped forward again, this time not toward the coffin, but toward Rex, aligning himself with the dog's direction rather than the ceremony's expectation. Behind him, the officers exchanged glances, uncertainty still present but no longer paralyzing, because the evidence lay open before them, undeniable in its quiet contradiction, and the path ahead, though unclear, had already begun to form. The rain eased to a faint mist, the air lightening slightly as though the world itself had released some of its tension, and in that softened moment, the meaning of what had just occurred settled into place, not as chaos, not as disruption, but as revelation. The farewell they had gathered to honor had not been wrong, but it had been misplaced, directed toward a truth that did not hold, and the real story, the one still unfolding, had never been inside that coffin at all. Rex took another step forward, steady, purposeful, and this time he did not look back, because he no longer needed to, the bond that had held him there now guiding him onward, away from the stillness of the grave and towards something that still lived, still waited, just beyond the reach of what anyone else had been willing to believe. Rex moved with quiet certainty, each step measured not in hesitation but in purpose, paws pressing into the damp grass as though following a path already laid out long before anyone else had begun to question it. And Noah followed without needing to be told, the distance between them closing naturally, as if the bond between dog and handler extended outward, pulling others into its orbit one decision at a time. Behind them, the ceremony dissolved without instruction, boots shifting out of formation, voices lowering into uncertain fragments, because once the coffin had been opened, once the truth inside it had fractured what they believed, there was no returning to the order they had prepared for, no simple way to place the moment back into structure. The officers exchanged brief, tense glances, not in defiance, but in recalibration, as though the rules they had relied upon were being rewritten in real time, and one by one, they began to follow, not out of command, but out of something quieter, something closer to trust. The path Rex took was not marked, not visible in any ordinary sense, but it held a direction that felt unmistakable, leading beyond the neat rows of stone and into the line of gum trees that bordered the far edge of the cemetery, where the air shifted, carrying the sharper scent of wet bark and earth, grounding, alive, different from the stillness they had left behind. Noah kept his eyes on the dog, watching the subtle cues, the slight turns of the head, the pauses that lasted only a second before movement resumed, each one carrying meaning that did not need explanation, because Rex was not searching, he was tracing, following something that had never been lost to him. A faint breeze moved through the leaves, rustling softly overhead, and for a moment the world felt wider again, less confined by expectation, as though stepping away from the coffin had also stepped them out of the certainty that had bound them to it. "Where is he going?" one of the younger soldiers murmured, not expecting an answer, and none came, because the question itself felt incomplete, as though it assumed they were still in control of the direction, when in truth they had already given that up the moment they chose to follow. Rex slowed as they reached the tree line, his pace shifting from steady to deliberate, head lowering slightly, nose close to the ground now, drawing in the scent with deeper focus, and Noah recognized the change immediately, the transition from movement to pinpoint, from direction to location. He raised a hand subtly behind him, not to stop the others entirely, but to quiet their approach, instinctively protecting whatever fragile truth Rex was closing in on. The ground here was uneven, soft from the rain, leaves scattered in loose patterns that shifted underfoot, and Rex moved through them with care, stepping around rather than through, preserving the trail only he could sense. Then he stopped, not abruptly, not with tension, but with a stillness that carried finality, as though he had reached the end of something and the beginning of something else. He stood there for a moment, body aligned forward, ears slightly raised, and then he looked back at Noah, not questioning, not seeking approval, but confirming, as if to say this is where you need to see. Noah stepped closer, closing the last half-meter between them, his eyes scanning the ground, the trees, the subtle details that had gone unnoticed before, and at first there was nothing obvious, nothing that stood out against the quiet natural order of the place, but then he saw it, a disturbance so slight it could have been dismissed entirely, a patch of earth where the leaves had been moved, not scattered by wind, but shifted by intent, their edges darker with moisture, their arrangement just uneven enough to break the pattern. He crouched slowly, boots sinking a few centimeters into the soft ground, and reached out, brushing the leaves aside with careful fingers, revealing soil beneath that had been recently disturbed, not deeply, not dramatically, but enough to suggest that something had happened here, something that had not yet been acknowledged. The others gathered closer now, their presence no longer hesitant, drawn by the same quiet gravity that had guided Rex, and the air seemed to tighten again, not with uncertainty this time, but with anticipation that felt grounded in something real. Rex remained still, watching, his focus no longer searching, because he had already done his part, already brought them to the place they needed to be, and now it was up to them to understand what he had shown. Noah's hand hovered above the soil for a moment, not touching it yet, as though respecting the weight of what might be revealed beneath it, and then he pressed lightly, feeling the texture, the looseness, the undeniable difference from the surrounding ground. He looked up at the others, meeting their eyes one by one, and there was no need for words, because the answer was already forming in all of them, fragile but undeniable, the same way it had formed at the Coffin, the same way it had followed Rex here. Whatever truth they had been given was incomplete, and whatever lay ahead would not be found in ceremony or report, but in moments like this, where instinct and loyalty had led them beyond what they had been told to accept. Rex took a small step forward, placing himself just beside Noah, close enough for their shoulders to nearly touch, and for the first time since leaving the Coffin, he let out a soft breath that carried something lighter within it. Not relief exactly, but confirmation, as though the path he had followed had brought them exactly where they needed to be, and whatever came next, they would face it not as a group bound by protocol, but as people who had chosen to listen to the one voice that had never doubted the truth. Noah did not rush, because something about the moment demanded patience, a kind of quiet respect for what had led them here, and he pressed his hand more firmly into the loosened soil, feeling the subtle give beneath his palm, the difference between untouched ground and something recently disturbed, something that had not yet settled back into stillness. The others stood close now, forming a loose circle without realizing it, their boots marking the damp earth in careful steps, no one speaking, no one breaking the fragile tension that held them suspended between discovery and understanding. While Rex remained beside Noah, steady and unmoving, his presence no longer urgent but certain, as if he had already seen the end of this path and was simply waiting for the others to catch up. Noah shifted slightly, kneeling down fully, his knees sinking a few centimeters into the softened ground, and he began to clear the surface with deliberate movements, brushing aside leaves and loose soil with his hands, each motion careful, controlled, revealing what lay beneath without force. The scent of earth rose stronger now, damp and rich, grounding the moment in something real, something tangible, and as the top layer gave way, a piece of fabric came into view, muted in color but unmistakable in texture, the edge of a uniform that did not belong to chance. Noah paused, his breath catching just slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of confirmation, and he glanced at Rex for a fraction of a second, the dog's gaze steady, unwavering, as if to say continue. With slower hands now, Noah cleared more of the soil, revealing the shape beneath, not fully, not yet, but enough to understand that this was no accident, no natural disturbance, but something placed, something hidden in a way that had almost gone unnoticed. One of the officers stepped closer, his voice low, barely above a whisper, asking if they should call it in, if this needed to be handled formally. But the words felt distant, secondary, because the truth was already here, already unfolding in front of them without waiting for permission. Noah shook his head slightly, not in dismissal, but in focus, and continued, his fingers working through the damp soil until more of the fabric was visible, along with the faint outline of something beneath it, something that carried a presence even before it was fully revealed. Rex leaned forward just a fraction, his nose drawing in the scent once more, and this time there was a shift in him, subtle but unmistakable, the tension that had held him rigid easing slightly, replaced by something quieter, something closer to relief. The breeze moved again through the trees, lighter now, carrying with it the scent of eucalyptus and rain, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath alongside them. Noah reached deeper, his hands careful as they uncovered more. And then he stopped, not because he had finished, but because he understood, because the shape, the position, the presence beneath the earth aligned with everything Rex had been trying to show them. He did not pull anything further into view, did not disturb more than necessary, instead resting his hands lightly against the exposed fabric, grounding himself in the reality of it. "He is not gone," Noah said, quietly, the words steady, not dramatic, not forced, but certain, carrying a weight that settled over the group in a way that no report or confirmation ever could. The others exchanged looks, not of confusion now, but of realization, the pieces aligning in their minds, the coffin, the wrong face, the behavior of the dog, all of it pointing to a truth that had been overlooked, misplaced somewhere between procedure and assumption. Rex stepped closer, placing himself beside Noah once more, his shoulder brushing lightly against him. And for the first time since the ceremony had begun, he lowered his head and rested it gently near Noah's arm, not in exhaustion, but in quiet affirmation, as though the need to hold everything together had finally eased. Noah exhaled slowly, the tension leaving his body in a controlled release, and he looked up at the others, meeting their eyes one by one, seeing the shift in each of them, the transition from doubt to belief, from uncertainty to action. "We follow this properly now," he said, his voice calm but firm, not a command in the traditional sense, but a direction that no one questioned, because it came not from rank, but from truth. The rain had almost stopped now, leaving only a fine mist that clung to the air, softening the edges of everything around them, and in that quiet, the weight of what had been uncovered settled fully into place. This was not an ending, not a farewell, but the beginning of something unfinished, something that required more than ceremony to resolve. Rex lifted his head again, his ears relaxed now, his gaze no longer searching but settled, as if the path ahead, though still uncertain to the others, was already clear to him, and he took a small step forward, not away from the spot, but along a direction that suggested there was more to follow, more to uncover beyond what they had already found. Noah rose slowly to his feet, brushing the damp earth from his hands, and without hesitation, he moved to stand beside Rex, aligning himself once again with the only guide who had never been wrong. The others followed in quiet agreement, no longer questioning the path, because they understood now that the truth they sought would not be found by looking where they had been told to look, but by trusting the one who had refused to let go. Rex did not hesitate this time, his movement steady and assured as he stepped forward along the edge of the tree line, nose low but no longer searching in uncertainty, instead following a direction that felt almost memorized, as though whatever connection guided him had grown stronger now that the truth had begun to surface. Noah matched his pace, close enough to read every shift in the dog's posture, every subtle change in rhythm, because he understood now that these small signals were not random, they were language, a form of communication that did not rely on words but carried meaning just as clearly. Behind them, the others followed in quieter formation, no longer bound by ceremony, but by a shared awareness that they were no longer dealing with what had been reported, but with something still unfolding, something alive in its own quiet way. The ground beneath their boots changed gradually, the softer earth giving way to firmer soil as they moved further from the cemetery, the scent of wet grass fading into the sharper note of eucalyptus bark and rain-soaked timber, and with it came a shift in atmosphere, less heavy, less confined, as though they had stepped out of a place meant for endings and into something that had not yet decided what it would become. Rex slowed near a narrow track that cut between the trees, barely visible, just a slight break in the undergrowth where footsteps had passed not long ago, and he paused there, lifting his head slightly, ears forward, drawing in the air rather than the ground, testing, confirming. Noah stopped beside him, eyes scanning the path, noticing the subtle signs now that he had been shown how to look, a broken twig, a faint impression in the damp soil, details small enough to miss, but clear enough once seen. "Someone came through here," Noah said quietly, not as a guess, but as a statement grounded in what lay before them, and no one argued, because the evidence, though delicate, was undeniable. Rex stepped onto the track, paws placing carefully, not disturbing more than necessary, and continued forward, his pace measured but unwavering, leading them deeper into the stand of trees where the light dimmed slightly, filtered through leaves that held the last of the rain in small, trembling drops. The air felt cooler here, the sound of the outside world fading into a softer hush, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the steady rhythm of their movement. And in that quiet, every detail seemed to carry more weight, every step more deliberate. Noah felt the shift within himself again, the moment where the unknown no longer felt distant but immediate, close enough to touch, and he stayed focused on Rex, trusting the path even when it led beyond what made sense on paper. They moved like this for several minutes, measured in meters rather than time, until Rex slowed again, his body tightening slightly, not in alarm, but in recognition, and he veered off the track just a few steps, stopping near a fallen log that lay half-covered in moss, its surface darkened by the rain. He circled once, then stood still, head angled toward the space beyond the log, gaze fixed on something that the others could not yet see. Noah stepped forward, closing the distance, his boots pressing into the softened ground as he moved around the log, and then he saw it. Not immediately, not in full, but enough to understand that they had reached something significant. A piece of equipment lay partially concealed against the base of the tree, not discarded, not lost, but placed with intent, its surface marked by moisture and time, yet still recognizable as military issue, something that did not belong in this quiet stretch of bushland unless it had been carried here deliberately. Noah crouched slowly, reaching out but not touching it yet, his eyes tracing the details, the straps, the fabric, the faint insignia that had not yet faded, and a weight settled in his chest as recognition took hold, not sudden, not overwhelming, but steady and undeniable. Rex stepped closer, lowering his head toward the object, inhaling once, then exhaling softly, and in that breath there was something different, something that had not been there before, not urgency, not warning, but confirmation that they were on the right path. He was here, Noah said quietly, the words carrying a certainty that no longer needed validation, and the others drew closer, their presence no longer hesitant but intent, because the distance between what they believed and what was real had narrowed to almost nothing. The breeze moved gently through the trees, lifting the edge of Noah's sleeve, brushing against Rex's fur, and for a moment the world felt suspended again, not in confusion this time, but in anticipation, as though whatever lay ahead was no longer hidden, only waiting to be found. Rex lifted his head and looked forward once more, beyond the log, beyond the object, toward a direction that had not yet revealed itself, and then he took another step, steady and sure, continuing along the path that only he seemed to fully understand, and Noah followed without hesitation, because there was no longer any doubt left to hold him back. Rex moved with a steadier rhythm now, no longer pausing to confirm each step, as if the trail ahead had become clearer, stronger, pulling him forward through the quiet stretch of bushland where the air carried a deeper stillness, broken only by the soft crunch of boots and the distant call of a bird echoing somewhere beyond the trees. Noah followed close behind, his gaze shifting between the dog and the ground ahead, noticing how the path subtly curved, how the vegetation changed, as though the land itself had been disturbed in small, almost respectful ways, not damaged, not torn, but moved with intention, with care. The others kept pace, their earlier uncertainty replaced by a shared focus that held them together without words, each step drawing them further away from the certainty of the cemetery and deeper into a place where answers were no longer structured, but discovered. The light filtered differently here, softer, diffused through the canopy in pale streaks that touched the ground in quiet patches, illuminating details that might otherwise have gone unseen. A faint imprint of a boot here, a broken branch there, each one subtle, each one part of a pattern that only revealed itself when seen as a whole. Rex slowed again, but this time it was not hesitation, it was awareness, his head lifting slightly, ears angling forward, his body aligning towards something ahead that had not yet come into view for the others. Noah felt it before he saw it, that quiet shift in the air, the sense that they were approaching something that carried weight, something that had been waiting, and he matched Rex's pace instinctively, slowing his own steps, allowing the moment to unfold without rushing it. They moved another few meters, the ground soft beneath their boots, until the trees opened just enough to reveal a small clearing, not wide, not dramatic, but distinct in its stillness, as though it existed slightly apart from the rest of the world. Rex stepped into it first, his movement careful, almost reverent, and then he stopped, standing at the edge of something that held his full attention. Noah followed, stepping into the clearing with a quiet breath, his eyes adjusting to the subtle change in light, and then he saw it. A makeshift shelter, small and simple, constructed from branches and fabric, positioned carefully against the base of a tree, not abandoned, not weathered by time, but maintained, its structure still holding shape despite the rain, as though it had been used recently, as though it still served a purpose. The air here felt different, warmer somehow, carrying a faint trace of something human, something lived, and Noah's chest tightened slightly as the realization began to settle in, not as a sudden shock, but as a steady understanding that grew with each second he stood there. Rex moved closer, his steps slow and deliberate, approaching the shelter with the same quiet certainty he had shown from the beginning, and he paused just before it, lowering his head, inhaling deeply, then exhaling in a long, steady breath that seemed to release something he had been holding since the moment they left the coffin. Noah stepped forward, closing the distance carefully, his movements instinctively cautious, not from fear, but from respect for whatever truth lay within reach, and he crouched slightly, his eyes scanning the shelter, taking in the details, the placement, the signs of use that confirmed what he already felt. A folded piece of cloth rested inside, dry despite the rain, a small container placed beside it, its lid secured, not discarded, not forgotten, but intentionally set, and the ground around it bore the marks of someone who had stayed, someone who had moved within this space with purpose. The others gathered at the edge of the clearing, their presence quiet, their attention fixed, because the meaning of what they were seeing did not need to be spoken. It was already there, forming in each of them, undeniable. Rex stepped forward one last time, closing the final distance, and then he stopped, his body lowering slightly as he sat beside the shelter, his posture calm, his gaze fixed ahead, no longer searching, no longer urging, but waiting. Noah felt the weight of that stillness settle around him, the kind that comes not from absence, but from presence, and he drew in a slow breath, steadying himself as he leaned slightly closer, his voice barely above a whisper, not calling out, not demanding, but offering something simple, something human. Liam, he said softly, the name carried gently into the space, not as a certainty, but as a possibility that had grown too strong to ignore. The forest seemed to hold that sound for a moment, letting it settle into the quiet, and Rex's ears twitched slightly, his head lifting just enough to show that he was listening, not to the echo, but to something beyond it. Noah remained still, his gaze fixed on the shelter, his breath slow, measured, because in that moment, everything that had led them here converged into a single point, a fragile line between belief and confirmation, and he knew, without needing to say it again, that they were no longer searching for answers, they were standing at the edge of them. No one moved at first, not because they were unsure, but because the moment demanded stillness, the kind that lets truth arrive on its own terms rather than being forced into the open, and Noah remained crouched beside the shelter, his eyes fixed, his breath slow, feeling the weight of the name he had spoken settle into the quiet space between trees and damp earth. Rex did not bark, did not shift with urgency, but his posture changed in a way only those closest could notice, a subtle lift of the chest, a steadier stance, as though something ahead had answered in a language beyond sound. The air carried a faint movement then, not wind, not the rustle of leaves, but something softer, something closer to presence, and Noah felt it before he saw it, that quiet shift that tells you are no longer alone. From behind the shelter, just beyond the edge where shadow met filtered light, a figure stirred, not sudden, not dramatic, but gradual, like something emerging from stillness rather than breaking it. The others held their breath without realizing, boots fixed in place, eyes drawn forward, because the moment did not feel like discovery, it felt like recognition arriving late. The figure stepped forward slowly, each movement careful, measured in quiet intention rather than urgency. And as the light touched him more clearly, the details began to align, not perfectly at first, not in a way that removed all doubt instantly, but enough for the heart to recognize before the mind could confirm. The uniform was worn but intact, the lines familiar, the posture unmistakable even in its weariness. And then the face came into view, not distant memory, not imagined, but present, real, carrying the marks of time passed in isolation, but still undeniably his. Noah did not speak again immediately, because the name he had already said now existed in front of him, no longer a question, no longer a possibility, but a truth that stood quietly between them. Rex moved then, not rushing, not breaking the stillness, but stepping forward with a calm certainty, closing the distance in a few steady strides until he stood just meters away, his gaze locked, his body aligned in a way that spoke of recognition deeper than sight. For a moment, neither moved further, dog and man facing one another in a silence that carried more meaning than any words could hold. And then Rex took the final steps, slow, deliberate, until he reached him, pressing forward gently, not with force, but with presence, his head lifting just enough to rest against the man's hand, as if confirming what he had known all along. Liam's hand moved instinctively, fingers brushing through the fur, steady despite everything. And in that simple contact, the distance between absence and return collapsed completely. Noah exhaled then, a breath he had not realized he was holding, and rose slowly to his feet, his eyes fixed on the scene, not needing confirmation from anyone else, because it was already there, undeniable in its quiet clarity. Behind him, the others shifted, not forward immediately, but enough to acknowledge what they were seeing, the disbelief fading into something steadier, something grounded in the reality unfolding before them. Liam looked up then, his gaze moving past Rex to Noah and the others, not startled, not confused, but calm in a way that suggested he had been expecting this moment, or at least not surprised by it, as though the world had finally caught up to something he had been living with quietly all along. "Took you long enough," he said softly, the words simple, carrying a faint trace of dry humor that felt so familiar it settled any remaining doubt. And Noah let out a short breath that almost became a laugh, though it stayed contained, respectful of the moment. "We had the wrong story," Noah replied, his voice steady, grounded, and Liam nodded slightly, his hand still resting against Rex, the connection unbroken. "Yeah," Liam said quietly, glancing down at the dog for a moment before looking back up. But he didn't. The words settled over them with a weight that was not heavy, but true, and Rex remained where he was, calm now, no longer holding tension, no longer searching, because the purpose that had driven him from the beginning had been fulfilled, not with noise, not with spectacle, but with the quiet return of something that had never truly been lost. The clearing seemed different now, not just a place hidden in the bush, but a point where two paths had finally met, where belief and reality had aligned in a way that left no room for doubt. And Noah stepped forward at last, closing the remaining distance, not as an officer, not as someone following protocol, but as a man standing in front of a truth he would carry with him long after this moment passed. The others followed more slowly, their movements measured, respectful, because what stood before them was not just the resolution of a mistake, but the reminder of something deeper, something that could not be written into reports or confined to ceremony, something that lived in the bond between a man and his dog, a bond that had refused to accept an ending that was never real. No one rushed forward to embrace him, not because they did not want to, but because the moment felt too precise, too sacred to disturb with anything hurried or loud. And Noah stopped just a few meters away, allowing the silence to stretch, to breathe, to settle around them like something earned rather than given. Liam remained where he stood, one hand resting lightly against Rex, the other relaxed at his side, his posture steady but not rigid, as though the weight he carried was no longer something he needed to fight against, but something he had learned to stand with. The shelter behind him, simple and quiet, no longer felt like a place of hiding, but a place of waiting, a space where time had moved differently, measured not in hours or days, but in endurance, in patience, in the quiet belief that something unfinished would one day find its way back. Rex shifted slightly, pressing closer to Liam's side, not seeking reassurance, but offering it, his presence calm now, grounded, the tension that had driven him replaced by a stillness that spoke of completion, and Liam's hand moved once more through the dog's fur, slow and familiar, a gesture that carried no urgency, only recognition. Noah stepped forward then, closing the final distance, his boots soft against the damp earth, and when he reached Liam, he did not reach out immediately, did not break the space between them with sudden contact, instead meeting his gaze first, allowing the reality of the moment to settle fully before acting on it. "We thought," Noah began, then stopped, the words trailing off because they no longer mattered in the way they once had, and Liam gave a small nod, understanding without needing explanation. "Yeah," Liam said quietly, his voice steady, grounded, carrying a weight that had been shaped by time but not diminished by it. "I know what you thought." The others moved closer now, their steps measured, respectful, forming a loose circle once more, not in ceremony this time, but in presence, each of them carrying their own version of disbelief that had already begun to shift into something steadier, something closer to acceptance. One of the officers cleared his throat softly, as if preparing to speak, but then hesitated, because there was no script for this, no procedure that accounted for a return like this, no set of instructions that could contain what they were witnessing. The breeze moved gently through the clearing, lifting a few loose strands of Liam's hair, brushing against the fabric of his uniform, and for a moment the world felt almost ordinary again, as though this quiet reunion existed outside of the disruption it had caused, outside of the confusion that still lingered beyond the trees. "We found the coffin," Noah said after a moment, his voice low, not accusatory, not questioning, just placing the truth between them, and Liam's expression shifted slightly, not in surprise, but in acknowledgement, as though he had expected that detail to surface eventually. "That was never meant for me," Liam replied, his tone calm, measured, and he glanced briefly toward the direction they had come from, then back again, grounding himself in the present. "Things got mixed up," he added, the words simple, carrying no need for elaboration, because the explanation, whatever it fully was, did not change the fact that he stood here now, alive, present, real. Noah nodded slowly, accepting the answer not because it resolved everything, but because it was enough for this moment, enough to move forward. Rex shifted again, turning slightly so that he stood between Liam and the others, not in defense, but in quiet connection, as though bridging the space between past and present, between what had been believed and what now stood undeniable. Liam looked down at him for a second, a faint smile touching the edge of his expression, not wide, not dramatic, but real in a way that needed no emphasis. "You kept going, didn't you?" Liam murmured softly, his voice meant for Rex alone, and the dog's ears flicked in response, his posture relaxed, as if the question itself carried its own answer. Noah let out a slow breath, his shoulders easing slightly, the tension that had built since the ceremony beginning to release, not all at once, but enough to feel the shift, and he glanced briefly at the others, seeing the same change reflected in them, the same quiet acceptance settling into place. "We need to get you back," one of the officers said gently, his voice careful, not commanding, not urgent, but grounded in responsibility, and Liam nodded again, not resisting, not hesitating, as though he had already known this part would come, already accepted that whatever had happened here would now need to rejoin the world beyond it. "Yeah," Liam said simply, his gaze steady, but not in a rush. The words settled with a quiet clarity, and no one argued, because they understood now that this moment, this space, held something that could not be hurried, something that deserved to be carried carefully, not just in action, but in understanding. Rex remained close, his presence constant, his purpose fulfilled but not finished, because whatever came next, whatever path led them away from this clearing and back into the structured world they had left behind, he would follow it the same way he had followed this one, with certainty, with loyalty, with a refusal to accept anything less than the truth he already knew. And as they stood there together, the clearing no longer felt like a place apart, but a point of return, a quiet crossing where what had been lost was not only found, but understood in a way that would not fade once they left it behind. They did not leave the clearing immediately, not because they did not know what needed to be done next, but because something in all of them understood that rushing this moment would break something fragile that had only just come back together. And Liam remained where he stood for a while longer, his gaze moving slowly across the trees, the shelter, the ground that had held him in quiet isolation, as though acknowledging it before letting it go. Rex stayed close at his side, not pressing, not pulling, simply present, his body aligned with Liam's as naturally as breath, the bond between them no longer strained by distance or uncertainty, but settled into something steady, something whole again. Noah watched them both, the stillness between them speaking more clearly than any explanation ever could, and he felt something shift inside himself, something that did not come from training or rank, but from witnessing a truth that could not be taught, only understood in moments like this. The others remained just behind, their formation loose, their posture no longer rigid, because the structure they had carried into the cemetery had softened here, replaced by something quieter, something more human. Liam took a slow breath, drawing in the scent of damp earth and eucalyptus, and then he turned slightly, facing the direction they had come from, the path that would lead them back, not just to the cemetery, but to everything that had been waiting beyond it. "I stayed because I had to be sure," he said quietly, not looking at anyone in particular, his voice carrying without effort, settling into the space as naturally as the rain had earlier, and Noah nodded once, understanding without needing the full story, because whatever had brought Liam here, whatever had kept him hidden, had already been justified by the fact that he stood here now, alive. "And now you are," Noah replied, his tone steady, not pressing for more, because this moment was not about explanations, it was about return. Liam gave a faint nod, his hand brushing once more over Rex's neck, a simple gesture that carried gratitude without needing to name it. And then he stepped forward, not away from the clearing, but through it, beginning the quiet movement back toward the world they had left behind. Rex moved with him instantly, falling into step at his side without command, without hesitation, as though the path ahead was simply the next part of something that had never truly been interrupted. Noah followed just behind, his pace matching theirs, his eyes occasionally drifting to Rex, still not fully able to grasp how the dog had known, how he had refused to accept what everyone else had taken as final, and yet not needing to understand it completely, because some things did not require explanation to be true. The others fell in behind them, their movement natural now, no longer guided by protocol, but by a shared recognition that they were part of something that would not fit neatly into any report or record. The path back felt different, though it was the same ground, the same trees, the same soft earth beneath their boots, because the direction had changed, and with it, the meaning of every step, each meter carrying them not toward an ending, but away from one that had never truly existed. The light shifted as they moved, breaking through the canopy in wider patches, touching Liam's shoulders, catching in Rex's fur, illuminating them in a way that felt almost deliberate, as though the world itself had adjusted to their return. Noah glanced ahead, seeing the faint outline of the cemetery beyond the trees, the structured lines waiting, the place where everything had nearly been sealed into a final story, and he felt a quiet weight settle in his chest, not heavy, not burdened, but meaningful, because what they were bringing back would change that place, reshape it, turn it from a site of farewell into something else entirely. Liam slowed slightly as they approached the edge of the clearing, his gaze steady, his posture composed, and for a brief moment he stopped, looking back over his shoulder, not at the others, but at the shelter, at the space that had held him, and then he turned forward again, letting it remain behind him without regret. Rex paused with him, following his gaze for a second, then shifting forward once more, ready, always ready, not to leave the past behind, but to carry it forward in a way only he understood. Noah stepped up beside Liam then, not in command, not in formality, but in quiet companionship, and for a moment they walked side by side, the distance between them measured not in rank, but in shared understanding. "We will sort the rest," Noah said softly, his voice calm, grounded, and Liam nodded, not because he needed reassurance, but because he accepted it, because the path ahead, whatever it held, no longer needed to be faced alone. And as they stepped out from the trees and back toward the place where everything had almost ended, it became clear that what had been found here would not just change a report or a ceremony, but something deeper, something that would remain long after the moment passed, carried quietly in the memory of those who had chosen to follow the one voice that never let go. When they stepped back into the cemetery, the air felt different, not lighter, not heavier, but changed in a way that could not be measured, as though the place itself had shifted to make room for a truth it had not expected to hold. And the rows of stone no longer felt like final markers, but quiet witnesses to something that had refused to end. The open coffin remained where they had left it, the flag still draped with careful precision, but now it carried a different meaning, no longer a symbol of farewell, but of a story interrupted before its time. And as Liam approached, his steps slowed slightly, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, acknowledging what had nearly been written in his place. Rex stayed close, his shoulder brushing lightly against Liam's leg with each step, his presence steady, unchanging, as though the distance they had crossed had only strengthened what had always been there. Noah moved just ahead, his posture straightening instinctively as they re-entered the structured space. But something in him remained different, something that no longer fit entirely within the lines he had followed before, and he paused near the coffin, turning to face Liam not as an officer addressing a formality, but as someone witnessing the return of something that had been wrongly taken. The others formed a quiet arc around them, their presence respectful, their voices absent, because no one wanted to break the moment with unnecessary words, and the silence that settled was not empty, but full, carrying the weight of everything that had led to this point. Liam stopped a few meters from the coffin, his gaze resting on it for a moment, taking in the details, the polished wood, the careful arrangement, the stillness that had almost claimed his name. And then he stepped closer, reaching out with a steady hand, not to open it further, not to disturb what lay within, but to acknowledge it, to recognize that whatever story belonged there was not his, but still mattered. His fingers brushed lightly against the edge, the contact brief but intentional, and then he withdrew his hand, letting it fall back to his side as he exhaled slowly, the breath carrying something final with it, not loss, but release. Rex stood beside him, watching, his head slightly tilted, his eyes calm, no longer searching, because the purpose that had guided him here had been fulfilled, and yet he remained, because loyalty does not end when the task is complete, it continues, steady and present. Noah stepped forward then, his voice low but clear, not carrying command, but acknowledgement. "We will correct this," he said, the words simple, grounded, and Liam gave a small nod, accepting them not as a promise that needed to be proven, but as something that would naturally follow. The breeze moved gently across the cemetery, lifting the edge of the flag for a moment before it settled again, and in that small motion, the scene felt less fixed, less final, as though even the symbols around them had shifted to reflect what had changed. One of the officers approached the coffin carefully, his movements deliberate, and he adjusted the flag slightly, not out of necessity, but as a gesture, a quiet act of respect for the person who lay within, ensuring that their story, though different, would still be honored with the same care. The others began to reposition themselves, not in the rigid lines of before, but in a more natural arrangement, their presence still formal, but softened by what they had experienced, because the structure remained, but the meaning had deepened. Liam turned slightly, his gaze moving across them, meeting each pair of eyes not with explanation, but with quiet recognition, as though acknowledging that they had all crossed something together, something that would remain even after this moment passed. Rex shifted again, stepping just ahead of Liam for a moment, then turning back, his movement small but intentional, as if to confirm that wherever Liam stood now, that was where he would remain, no longer needing to lead, only to stay. Noah felt the weight of the moment settle fully then, not as something overwhelming, but as something steady, something that would stay with him long after the details faded, and he drew in a slow breath, the scent of damp earth and polished wood grounding him in the present. "Ready when you are," Noah said quietly, not directing, not urging, simply acknowledging that the next step belonged to Liam now. Liam glanced once more at the coffin, then back at Rex, his expression calm, composed, and he gave a slight nod, not dramatic, not final, just enough to signal that he was ready to move forward, to step out of what had nearly been written and into what still remained unwritten. And as they stood there, between what had almost ended and what had quietly returned, it became clear that this was not just a correction of a mistake, but a reminder, carried in silence, that some bonds do not accept endings they do not recognize, and in refusing to let go, they bring truth back with them. The moment did not end with a command, nor with a formal dismissal, but with something quieter, something that settled into the space like a final breath released after being held too long, and Liam stood there for a second longer, his eyes moving once more across the faces around him, taking in the presence of those who had come to say goodbye and instead found themselves standing at the beginning of something returned. Rex remained at his side, close enough that their movements aligned without effort, his posture relaxed but attentive, no longer searching, no longer questioning, simply present in the way only he could be, as though his purpose had shifted from guiding to guarding, from proving to staying. Noah stepped back slightly, not retreating, but allowing the moment to belong to Liam fully, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his shoulders no longer held in the rigid line of ceremony, because whatever this was now, it was no longer something that needed to be contained within formality. The others followed that same quiet instinct, their positions softening, their expressions no longer fixed in solemn expectation, but open, grounded in the reality before them. And for a brief moment, no one moved at all, as though the world itself had paused to let the truth settle completely. Liam exhaled slowly, the breath steady, measured, and then he took a step forward, not toward the coffin, not toward the past, but along the path that would carry him beyond it, his movement calm, unhurried, as though he understood that what had nearly been written no longer held any claim over him. Rex moved with him instantly, his shoulder brushing lightly against Liam's leg, his head level, his eyes forward, and in that simple alignment, the bond between them felt complete again, not because it had been broken, but because it had endured. Noah fell into step a moment later, not beside Liam this time, but just behind, allowing the space ahead to remain clear, his presence steady, supportive, and the others followed in the same quiet rhythm, forming a loose line that carried no command, only shared direction. As they moved past the rows of stone, the cemetery no longer felt like a place of endings, but like something else entirely, something that had witnessed a truth it could not hold, something that would remember even when the details faded. The breeze moved gently again, carrying the scent of damp grass and eucalyptus, and the sky above had begun to clear, the heavy gray lifting just enough to allow a softer light to filter through, touching the ground in pale, steady strokes that followed them as they walked. Liam glanced down briefly at Rex, his hand resting once more against the dog's neck, fingers pressing lightly into the fur in a gesture that needed no explanation, and Rex responded with the smallest shift, leaning just slightly into the contact, not seeking it, but accepting it as something already understood. "You never left," Liam said quietly, his voice low, almost lost in the open air, but close enough for Noah to hear, and Rex's ears flicked once in response, his pace unchanged, his focus steady ahead. Noah allowed himself a small breath that almost carried the shape of a smile, though it remained subtle, because this was not a moment for display, it was a moment for understanding, and he felt that understanding settle deeper with each step they took. Behind them, the coffin remained where it was, no longer the center of the story, no longer the final point of a line, but simply a part of something that had been corrected, something that would be handled, respected, and remembered in its own way, while the true story continued forward beyond it. Liam did not look back, not because he dismissed what had happened, but because he no longer needed to hold on to it, the past acknowledged, the present claimed, and the future waiting without urgency. The path led them toward the gate, the boundary between the quiet order of the cemetery and the wider world beyond, and as they approached it, the sense of transition became clearer, not dramatic, not marked by any visible change, but felt in the subtle shift of air, of light, of movement. Rex crossed that boundary first, his steps steady, his presence unchanged, and Liam followed without hesitation, his posture relaxed, his gaze forward, carrying with him not the weight of what had nearly been lost, but the quiet certainty of what had been found. Noah paused for just a second at the threshold, his eyes moving back across the cemetery one last time, not in farewell, but in acknowledgement, and then he stepped through as well, leaving behind